It started with the little things. A laugh that didn't match the joke. A glance held a second too long. A story that changed, ever so slightly, each time it was told. I've always been the quiet one, the listener. The one who blends in. The one who keeps the peace. They thought that meant I wasn't paying attention. But here's the truth. I see everything. I hear what you don't say. And when the pieces stop fitting, I start digging. They underestimated the girl who never raises her voice. But silence isn't the same as surrender. It's the calm before the storm. Liam's rooftop birthday party unfolded like a Pinterest dream. Sunset hues bleeding into city lights, jazz-infused lo-fi echoing through overhead speakers, and guests dressed like they belonged on mood boards rather than in real life. Champagne flutes clinked like wind chimes in the breeze. The air was thick with curated joy and passive competition. Harper stood off to the side, near the garden lights that blinked too slowly, as if unsure whether they belonged in the scene. She held a glass of something citrusy, the kind of cocktail made more for photos than for drinking, and watched the room from her usual place, half in, half out. It was her comfort zone. Invisible but observant. Forgettable, but never unaware. She'd come with Casey, of course. He peeled off to talk to Liam within minutes, engaging in a layered discussion about some new startup Liam was funneling money into. Harper didn't mind. She liked to linger on the edges. Watching people when they thought they weren't being watched told you more than anything they ever said. And that's when Jasmine arrived. She didn't explode into the party like some people do. She didn't announce herself. But the atmosphere shifted when she walked in, as if a new perfume had entered the space. Sharp, floral, distracting. She wore a silk top that clung like static and a smile too polished for the moment. Her hair was still damp, curled around her neck like she'd just stepped out of the shower. She wasn't late enough to be rude, just late enough to be noticed. Harper caught it immediately. The timing. The softness in her eyes that wasn't there last week. The way she made a slow, purposeful loop through the crowd, saying brief hellos, but not stopping to chat. A glide. A hunt. She moved toward Casey with a casualness so deliberate it was almost theatrical. Her body language was loose, but her posture was calculated. Harper's gaze narrowed, and her grip tightened just slightly around her glass. It wasn't that Jasmine hugged him. They were all friends. Of course she hugged him. But the hug was slow. She leaned in with both arms, her head tilted toward his neck. Harper saw the way Casey's eyes darted over Jasmine's shoulder too quickly, not landing anywhere specific. Not toward her. Not toward anyone. Just away. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't proof. But Harper had learned long ago that truth didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispered. Jasmine pulled away and laughed at something Casey said or maybe didn't. Her hand brushed his arm for a beat too long. Then she glanced sideways, and for the briefest moment, Harper was certain Jasmine didn't think she was looking. But Harper was. She always was. She didn't move. Didn't make a scene. She simply cataloged it, timestamped the moment in her mind. She watched Jasmine blend into the crowd, watched Casey adjust the collar of his shirt like his skin felt too tight. Watched him take a long drink, his eyes scanning, not searching for Harper, but scanning like he didn't know where to look. Like something needed covering. The rest of the party pulsed around her in waves of laughter, clinking glass, and echoing music. But inside Harper, things went still. This wasn't the first time she had noticed something off lately. Casey had been different these past few weeks. Distracted, too affectionate at strange moments and oddly cold at others. And Jasmine had been unpredictable. She'd been canceling on plans Harper suggested, skipping their usual Saturday coffee meetups, sending odd, vague texts. Nothing blatant. But strung together, it all formed a pattern. She didn't want to believe it. They were her best friend and her boyfriend. Her people. But she also knew what it felt like to ignore your instincts until it was too late. There was a time Harper would have talked herself out of this, called herself paranoid, overly sensitive, too introverted for the real world's messiness. But she wasn't that girl anymore. Not since the night spent listening to strangers on the crisis hotline. People whose lives cracked in the dark when no one else was listening. She'd learned to hear the tremors in voices, the shakiness in words, the unspoken truths trembling beneath polite conversation. It had changed the way she moved through the world. And now it helped her see everything others missed. She finished her drink in one long sip, the citrus burning faintly down her throat. A warmth spread through her, not from the alcohol, but from clarity. She didn't know the full story yet, but she knew enough to know that something wasn't right. The rooftop lights flickered again, catching in the curl of Jasmine's hair as she leaned against the railing, smiling at someone else like nothing was broken. Casey stood a few feet away, texting with an expression he probably thought was neutral. But Harper saw the tension in his jaw, the flick of his thumb hovering too long over the screen. They weren't being obvious, but they weren't careful either. They underestimated her. People often did. They saw someone quiet and assumed she was meek. They mistook stillness for smallness. They didn't understand that when you grow up having to read the room to survive, you get very good at spotting the lies in it. Harper set her empty glass on a table with practiced ease. Her heart wasn't pounding. There was no rush of rage or panic. Just focus. Just decision. Just a quiet, undeniable shift. They had no idea what they'd started. But Harper did. The days that followed moved with a strange duality. On the surface, everything appeared the same. Jasmine sent the usual memes to the group chat. Casey kissed Harper's forehead in the morning, made coffee like he always did, and scrolled through his phone with practiced nonchalance. Life, it seemed, continued. But for Harper, everything had changed. It wasn't the hug. It wasn't even the look in Jasmine's eyes. It was what came after, the silence that buzzed too loudly, the text responses that arrived too quickly or far too late, the shifting gravity in her shared moments with Casey. Like the air between them had thickened, like the house had a new ghost neither of them acknowledged. Harper began collecting moments the way a detective gathers evidence, not frantically, but methodically. Her strength had always been in noticing what others dismissed. It came from years of being the emotional cushion in every relationship she'd ever had. She was the one who remembered your favorite cereal, the one who could sense you were lying even if you smiled. People loved her for it, until they realized she saw too much. And now, it was a skill honed into something sharper. Casey started leaving his phone face down. Not always. Just enough to make it noticeable. Sometimes it would buzz at odd hours, late evening or during showers. He always checked it quickly, the screen angled away, then dismissed it like it was nothing. Sometimes he even chuckled, like he wanted her to ask what was funny. She never did. Jasmine had grown selective with her attention. No more impromptu FaceTime calls. No more lengthy updates about her latest situationship disasters. The friendship still existed, on paper, but its heartbeat had slowed. She was always just getting back to you. Always conveniently occupied. Harper didn't confront. She observed. She began running solo errands she didn't need to run, taking different routes home, circling timelines in her mind. She began noticing patterns. Casey had said he was meeting Liam one Thursday night, but Liam had posted from a movie theater across town. Harper recognized the neon lighting in the background instantly. Jasmine had mentioned going to visit her cousin that weekend, yet Harper spotted her car parked 3 blocks from their favorite Italian cafe, right near the place Casey liked to pick up obscure vinyl records. Small details, nothing definitive, but together, they painted a kind of truth that didn't need a smoking gun. It was the soft ache of intuition turning into confirmation. She didn't cry. Not yet. It wasn't grief. Not exactly. It was more like a hollowing out, a quiet process of letting go of illusions. Harper had once believed that if she loved gently enough, loyally enough, people would choose her. But love wasn't currency. It couldn't buy honesty. It couldn't protect you from the ways people fail you. Still, she didn't act. Not yet. Because this wasn't about revenge or drama. It was about clarity, control, and timing. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, while Casey was out running errands, Harper sat at their kitchen table with a notebook she hadn't used in years. The cover was frayed, the pages filled with scribbles from college, notes from her psychology course, quotes from crisis counseling manuals, reminders to breathe. She flipped to a fresh page and started writing, not evidence, but questions. Not accusations, but observations. She wasn't preparing for a fight. She was preparing for truth. And the deeper she leaned into herself, the more a sense of calm washed over her. This wasn't high school heartbreak. This was womanhood, steady, aware, unwilling to shatter just because the foundation cracked. That night, Casey came home with takeout from her favorite Thai place. He smiled like nothing was wrong, sat across from her, and asked how her day had been. She answered without flinching. There was no accusation in her eyes, just depth, like a lake that looked calm until you realized how far down it went. He didn't notice the shift. Not yet. But he would. She knew what came next. The denial. The gaslighting. The possibility of charm weaponized into deflection. She'd counseled too many people through it not to expect the pattern. But what they didn't expect was that she'd be ready. She thought about Jasmine, too. How someone could share so many years of secrets and sleepovers, only to slide sideways into deceit like it was nothing. The betrayal didn't come with fanfare. It crept in during pauses between trust. But Harper didn't feel rage. Not yet. What she felt was a slow reclaiming of power. Because while Jasmine had her allure, and Casey had his charm, Harper had something rarer, clarity. The ability to see people not as they pretend to be, but as they truly are. It was a skill that had once left her lonely, but now, it left her ready. She no longer needed a confrontation to validate what she knew. Truth didn't always need to be shouted to matter. Sometimes, truth sat quietly in your bones until the moment arrived to set it free. And Harper? She was waiting for that moment. Not with fists, not with rage, but with a knowing that could not be shaken. Long before she ever suspected Casey or watched Jasmine recalibrate loyalty into betrayal, Harper had learned how to sit with silence. The kind of silence that didn't comfort, it scraped. She'd grown up in a house where words were rarely kind, and quiet was either punishment or aftermath. Her father was a man of sharp edges and heavy shoes. Her mother, a ghost still tied to her body, floated through the days trying not to provoke him. Harper survived by noticing. When her father's tone dipped an octave, she knew to retreat. When the tension in her mother's hands reached a certain stillness, Harper knew the tears would come once the door closed. She learned to interpret shadows, to catalog the spaces between spoken sentences, to listen for truths people didn't say. By the time she was old enough to leave, she didn't just want to escape. She wanted to understand. She wanted to know why people hurt each other without raising their voices. Why the wounds you can't see often left the deepest scars. That's what led her to volunteer work, first in small doses, then as a kind of second life. One night a week became 2, then 3. Then the hotline training began. She'd sit in a dim room with a headset and a cup of too sweet coffee, listening to strangers unravel in real time. People who felt invisible, discarded, betrayed. And Harper, soft-voiced and focused, would guide them back to something resembling breath. Not with advice, never with advice, but with presence, with seeing them. It rewired her. Slowly, surely, she stopped trying to be loud enough to be heard and started learning how to be still enough to notice what others missed. By the time she met Casey, she wasn't looking for anyone to save her. She just wanted something simple. He was charming, yes, but more than that, he was ordinary in a way that felt safe. He talked in circles about things like craft beer and indie films. He wore hoodies with soft insides and kissed her like he meant it. He was easy to love because he never pushed too hard. But simplicity is not the same as safety. And Harper, with her years of invisible listening, had learned to detect performance. It didn't matter how subtle. It always showed. She began to think about that skill more deliberately now, not as a passive trait, but as a finely tuned instrument. Her ability to perceive the shifts in people, their hesitations, the way their voices caught when they lied, the micro-reactions they thought went unnoticed, that wasn't intuition. It was training. It was work. And it was the key to everything. She started applying it. At work, she began watching her coworkers more closely. In meetings, she noticed how Mark from accounting avoided looking at the CFO when questioned. How Andrea always sat closest to the exit. She saw the patterns most people missed. The survival instincts woven into office politics. In her daily routines, she mapped human behavior like a scientist. The way the barista hesitated before handing a coffee to a man with a loud tone. The way the woman at the bookstore flinched every time her phone buzzed. Harper saw it all, not as noise, but as data. And in that, she began reclaiming something powerful. Her perception wasn't a curse. It wasn't just a tool for pain. It could be a compass. Casey and Jasmine might have believed they were being discreet, but Harper had built her strength in the shadows. While they were weaving half-truths and trying not to be obvious, she was already 10 steps ahead, connecting patterns, decoding silences, reading the stories between each flicker of their facades. She realized the reason she hadn't confronted them yet wasn't fear. It was design. Confrontation, for them, would be temporary. They'd deflect, deny, maybe even cry. But evidence, patterns, intention, those would last. And Harper wasn't interested in theatrical moments. She wanted to make it undeniable, And so, she waited. Not passively, but actively. She began keeping a private log, writing down the dates, the inconsistencies, the overlaps in stories. She started snapping innocuous photos, timestamps of Jasmine's car in unusual places, screenshots of conflicting posts. She wasn't building a case out of revenge. She was building clarity. Because she knew people like Casey. Knew the way charm could dissolve guilt. Knew how easily manipulators could twist words until the truth looked like hysteria. But she also knew something else. She knew that once you see clearly, there's no going back. And once you force someone to see you clearly, they can't ever unsee it. Harper wasn't just reacting to betrayal anymore. She was reclaiming her space in the narrative. She wasn't the quiet girlfriend who'd be talked out of her own instincts. She wasn't the best friend who would be made to feel crazy or dramatic. She was someone who had spent years helping strangers pick up the pieces of their broken nights. And now, she was preparing to do it for herself. Not with noise, but with precision. And once she was ready, she wouldn't just expose the truth. She'd end the performance. Harper didn't plan a dramatic reveal. There were no text messages printed out in red circles, no orchestrated confrontation over candlelight. That wasn't her style. Truth didn't need theatrics. It only needed light. And Harper had spent weeks preparing to flick the switch. She chose a Thursday. Midweek held a certain neutrality. Not heavy with the expectation of the weekend, not weighed down by the beginning of the week fatigue. It was also Casey's game night with his co-worker Liam, the same Liam who'd been tagged at a sushi restaurant 20 minutes before the so-called board game setup. By then, Harper had all she needed. Photos, timestamps, calendar overlaps, a subtle trail of quiet infidelity. And Jasmine's role? Less like a friend, more like an accomplice. Her betrayals weren't just emotional, they were calculated. Shared weekends, coincidental coffee meetups, posts carefully scrubbed of location tags. She'd done everything right, if right meant staying hidden from someone not trained to see people clearly. Harper set the scene. She made dinner. Nothing fancy, just roasted vegetables, jasmine rice, and the marinated tofu Casey always said reminded him of their early dates. A candle, a playlist, the kind of setup that said, "We're still okay." That was important. She wanted him disarmed. He came home, unbothered, keys jingling, a slight hum in his throat as he tossed his jacket onto the hook. She watched his face as he saw the dinner. Surprise, slight confusion, then a smile, a reflex he didn't even question. They ate. She asked about work. He answered in vague phrases, still oblivious. Afterward, Harper stood and gathered the plates, her fingers steady as she placed them in the sink. No tremble, no second-guessing. Then, without ceremony, she handed him the notebook. Not the whole thing, just the last 10 pages, carefully copied and organized. Dates, observations, an outline of inconsistencies, a quiet map of betrayal, each moment laid bare in handwriting soft and precise. At first, he didn't understand. He flipped through it, brow furrowed, lips parted like he might say something. But the deeper he read, the more his expression shifted, from confusion to discomfort, then to panic's edge. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. He looked up at her finally, like a boy who'd just been caught breaking something he swore he hadn't touched. His mouth opened, closed. His fingers twitched like they might reach for her hand. But Harper had already stepped back, out of reach, into clarity. "You've been keeping track?" His voice probably would have said, if this were a story with dialogue. But this wasn't about what he said. It was about what she already knew. And in that moment, it wasn't just about Casey. It was about Jasmine. It was about every person who had once looked at Harper's gentleness and mistaken it for weakness. Every friend who used her as a secret keeper but never bothered to keep hers. Every ex who thought she'd forgive just because she didn't scream. Harper walked to the side table and picked up the second envelope. This one had copies, screenshots of Jasmine's messages from a shared iCloud backup Casey hadn't realized she had access to. A security lapse. He hadn't even changed the password from the one she created when they first moved in. That irony tasted like steel. She left the envelope on the table and turned back to the room. Casey still sat there, eyes downcast, fingers now motionless. The notebook in front of him like evidence at a trial he hadn't prepared for. Harper didn't speak. She didn't need an apology. Apologies were for accidents. This was not one. Instead, she walked out. Not forever, but long enough. She drove to the lake on the edge of town, parked in the gravel lot where the water flickered under street lamp glow. She sat with the windows down, wind curling through her hair. Her hands were calm, her breathing steady. It wasn't triumph that filled her. It was release. She didn't feel proud. She felt aligned, like the world had finally tilted into place around her, like she had exited a performance and stepped into something honest. She stayed there for an hour. By the time she returned, the house was quiet. Casey was gone. The notebook and envelope remained. She didn't need to ask where he went. Later that night, her phone buzzed with a message from Jasmine. Not a confession, not remorse, just one sentence. I guess you know. Harper didn't respond. There were no words left for people who thought truth was negotiable. She slept well that night, better than she had in weeks. The kind of sleep that comes not from exhaustion, but from peace. From reclaiming the parts of yourself that others tried to chip away. In the morning, she made coffee and looked out at the street as the sun cracked through the blinds. It wasn't over, but it was hers now. The narrative, the truth, the next chapter. No one had given her closure. She had written it herself. It took a few days for the silence to settle. Not the uneasy silence of secrets barely held together, but a deeper kind. The kind that follows release. The moment when something long clenched is finally, irrevocably let go. Harper moved through those days with deliberate quiet. She kept her routines. Work, tea at sunset, long walks that stretched until the streetlights flickered on. The world didn't shift dramatically around her. No one applauded. No one gasped in the streets. But she felt it. The internal realignment. The breath that finally reached the bottom of her lungs. At work, people noticed something. Not a glow, not some exaggerated empowerment arc, but a steadiness. The way she held eye contact just a few seconds longer. The way her voice landed a little firmer when speaking in meetings. She wasn't louder, just more there. Andrea from HR, who had always treated Harper with distant professionalism, stopped her in the hallway one morning. She didn't ask what had changed, just handed her a small notebook and said, "You always seem to see what matters. Thought you might like this." The pages were blank, but the gesture wasn't. At the grocery store, Harper saw Jasmine once. Briefly, aisle 6, near the frozen fruit. Jasmine turned sharply, pretending to examine a bag of mango chunks, fingers gripping the plastic like it might save her. Harper didn't approach. She didn't need to. The power in that moment wasn't confrontation. It was presence. Jasmine knew she'd been seen, not just caught, but understood. And Harper, steady in her skin, walked past without pause. That was the ripple. Not revenge, not reputation, but recognition. People began to notice her, not in the way one notices someone who's suddenly louder or more demanding, but in the way a lens finally comes into focus. The woman who listened deeply. The woman who read the undercurrents. The one who always made others feel understood, now applying that same clarity inward. Even her own reflection surprised her. Not in its appearance, but in its energy. She stood straighter now. Not defensively, but with ownership. She'd stopped folding into spaces. She no longer made herself smaller to make others comfortable. There was no need to dim anything for anyone. One evening, Harper found herself back at the lake, the same spot where she had once sat in the dark, letting the cold air wash over her grief. This time, the sky was clear, the water calm. She watched a pair of ducks skimming the surface, leaving small ripples that vanished before reaching the shore. She thought about her father, not with pain, but with distance. His absence had once shaped everything. His unpredictability, his voice in the walls, had been the storm cloud over her childhood. But now, he felt like a story she'd outgrown. A version of the world she no longer lived inside. Her mother, too, always trying to disappear without leaving. Harper realized now how deeply she'd internalized that dance of silence and self-preservation. How long she tried to fix things with stillness, with patience, but not anymore. Patience, she'd learned, didn't mean waiting to be treated better. It meant knowing your own worth even when others didn't. And as she sat by the lake, wrapped in a jacket that smelled faintly of lavender and old books, Harper allowed herself to feel something close to pride. Not for exposing Casey or walking away from Jasmine, but for reclaiming her intuition. For refusing to be gaslit out of her own clarity. For taking the long way through betrayal and emerging intact. She thought about the people still stuck in their stories. The ones who hadn't yet found the moment to say, enough. She hoped they would. And maybe, just maybe, her story, quiet as it was, could ripple outward. Maybe the coworker who always second-guessed herself would stop shrinking in meetings. Maybe someone else would listen to the uneasy feeling in their gut and trust it before it became proof. Maybe the idea that strength had to look like shouting would soften a bit, making room for a different kind of power. One built on seeing, listening, knowing. Later that week, Harper received a message from someone unexpected. Liam, Casey's coworker, the one she'd assumed was part of the cover story. It was brief, respectful, just a note to say he hadn't known, that he distanced himself quietly when things started to feel wrong. That, oddly enough, her silence had said more than 1,000 accusations ever could. Harper didn't respond, but she smiled, because the truth always found its own way out. Even if not everyone was ready to hear it, even if some pretended they never saw it, someone always did. In the end, Harper didn't become someone new. She became someone fully. The woman who could make sense of chaos without creating it. The one who didn't burn bridges, but no longer stood on ones that cracked beneath her. The one who knew that sometimes, rising above didn't mean soaring. It meant standing. Fully. Firmly. Unshaken. And when the world tried to make her feel small again, underestimated again, unseen again, she'd simply remember. They mistook her quiet for weakness. But it was the silence between the notes that made the music matter. A month passed. Harper didn't rush the healing. There were no dramatic public goodbyes or grand gestures. It wasn't that she'd forgiven Casey or Jasmine, but something shifted in her that made forgiveness irrelevant. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about her. She had moved beyond the need for answers or apologies. She had written her own chapter. The wounds weren't erased, but the scars were fading into something that no longer held weight. Something that didn't burden her steps. Each day felt lighter, not because the past was forgotten, but because she had redefined her relationship with it. At work, her presence had become unmistakable. Not in a showy, attention-grabbing way, but in the quiet moments when others sought her advice or asked her opinion. Her expertise, her careful observation, had always been there, but now it had been acknowledged. Her ability to listen without judgment, to assess without bias, made her invaluable. Andrea had pulled her aside one day in the break room, her usual formality replaced by a warmth that hadn't been there before. "You know," she said, "I've always admired how you hold your ground." Harper smiled softly, but didn't respond. Words weren't necessary anymore. At home, the house was different. Not in its structure, but in its atmosphere. It was calm, peaceful. Harper had spent a weekend rearranging the furniture in the living room, as though in some small act of rebellion against the clutter of the past. It felt right. Fresh. Like she had reclaimed something deeply personal. Casey's absence was a quiet thing. She hadn't seen him since that night, but in her heart, she had already closed the door. She had no intention of contacting him, and there was a part of her that was grateful he hadn't tried to reach out either. What more was there to say? The truth had been exposed. The silence between them was not a rift, it was a respectful distance. Jasmine had also faded from the edges of her life. Harper knew their friendship had been built on fragile ground, and now it was gone. She didn't hate Jasmine. She simply recognized that some relationships are meant to end when one person finds the courage to stop pretending. It was not for Harper to fix anymore. Not for anyone. On a Saturday morning, Harper took her usual walk by the lake, watching the sun rise over the water, casting golden hues on everything it touched. She wasn't angry. She wasn't resentful. She was, simply, present. There was power in that, power in not needing to change anything, in just being, in understanding that life was already unfolding as it should. She learned that strength didn't always have to be loud. It wasn't in the confrontations or the demand for justice. It was in the quiet moments where she had the courage to just be herself. It was in the power of choosing to move forward without dragging the weight of the past with her. As she walked, her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. "I'm proud of you," it read. "I hope you know that." Harper paused, feeling the warmth of that simple message spread through her like sunlight. For the first time in a long time, she understood what it meant to feel proud of herself, too. The world hadn't changed in dramatic ways, but Harper had. She had shed the version of herself who believed she needed others' approval. She had embraced the truth of her own resilience, quiet but steadfast. It was enough. It always had been. The ripples of her choices continued, subtly shaping the world around her. No applause. No fanfare. But Harper knew that true strength never required validation. It only needed to be. And for the first time, that was enough.